Welcome to Fellowship Safaris, conversations about people of color and their journeys to subspecialist training in their countries of origin and around the world. Hi, everyone. I am really excited for today's episode because you get to meet a good friend of mine who's done some amazing things professionally, and she will be sharing with us about her wonderful medical education journey from way back when to now. I won't get ahead of myself. I'd like to give her an opportunity to introduce herself and her professional qualifications.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Rasika Singh. Right now, I'm a subspecialty adolescent medicine resident, PGY5. We're in my 5th year of postgraduate training. In terms of my background, I don't know if I should get into that right now.
Yeah. We'll get into it in just a bit.
Okay.
Welcome, Rasika. This is very exciting to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Jerry.
And so I am just going to jump right into it. I wanted to start by asking, when you think back to when you were much younger, when was the first time you realized that you wanted to get into medicine and become a doctor?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wasn't one of those young people that knew right away. I had different dream jobs growing up, one of being a farmer and then of being a librarian. But I think what really inspired me was when I started to just chat a little bit more with my mom growing up. So my mom, she's a family physician who trained back home, but she actually doesn't practice after she immigrated to Canada. She did choose to remain in the healthcare field and often talked about her interactions with patients and how meaningful it was to her and how that still was something that was a motivating factor in her work. And so it always just stuck out to me that, she worked so hard to achieve this career, kind of had to start from scratch and still chose to remain in that industry for some reason, some pull. So I would say around that stage, so I was still young, this would be like kind of high school time that I decided I think medicine, or at least working in the field of healthcare, would be what I wanted.
When you talk about home before immigrating to Canada, where is home?
Oh, yes, in India.
Okay. I'm so glad to hear that mom was so influential in terms of the direction and the trajectory your professional practice took. And in terms of growing up in Canada and being in the education system, how was that experience for you as a young woman of color?
It's a really good question. And I think probably a common, or at least a shared experience among people who grew up sort of second generation Canadian, where your parents were immigrants to the country. I feel like it was a little bit of a tension between wanting to grow up with the ideals and values that my parents had, which were more so from back home, from India, and sort of how they were raised, but then also wanting to fit in with the Western culture. And it was like hard, definitely at a young age, to find a nice mesh of the two. And I would say, speaking to your question about being a young girl or woman of color, I did not even realize how different I looked until it was pointed out to me by one of my peers. And I can remember it was in grade 1, and I remember what was said to me. And that's the moment I realized, like, oh, I look different. I'm a different color. People have different assumptions about me. And it was interesting because it just wasn't something we were raised with, per se, to look for. But once you learn that, you never unlearn it. And then you sort of figure out how to navigate that space. But prior to that, I would say I felt just the same as everyone. And then I didn't.
And that sounds like a very, sort of experience. And, just also reflecting on, despite having this experience of in grade 1, someone making a comment, and fast forward to when you'd have these conversations with mom about getting into medicine, did this identity have any impact when you were doing your applications for medical school?
So certainly it did. I mean, I'm sure there was different factors I was sort of considering at that time, which was that I didn't have parents that went through the education system in Canada. So even though I have parents that did have the opportunity to pursue a lot of higher post-secondary education, it wasn't in this country. And so navigating that space, my brother's 2 years older than me, so he was the first, and then I was the second to sort of figure out how to even navigate applications to university and then kind of our subsequent paths. Speaking to like the medical school process, I felt as though I was completely oblivious to, I guess you could say, the kind of quote unquote hidden curriculum or the politics of how to navigate a system like this. And I don't know if it's necessarily because of my unique situation, having parents that are immigrants and or just not having sort of that legacy of family members that have navigated and succeeded in the system prior to me to pass that down their wisdom. I would say in that sense, sort of being the first person in your family, that was probably how I would speak to the influence of culture and race in that game.
That's such an interesting perspective when you talk about, all these different factors, and we're not quite sure which one played the biggest role. After completing medical school, when did you decide that it was adolescent medicine that would be the area of your specialty, and why?
Yeah, it's funny because actually like I'll speak to some sort of what I didn't know as I sort of move through my training. And I think this all stems from the fact that I really just didn't have someone close to me lead the way that I could sort of look up to and shadow and follow even. I remember my first day of medical school, the dean spoke with us and was making a joke about how some of my classmates are probably already worried about CARMS. I didn't even know what CARMS was. I was like, now there's this thing that I'm supposed to be worried about that I don't even know what it is. And so, similarly, in a kind of ironic way, I actually didn't know what adolescent medicine was until I matched a pediatric residency. I was in pediatrics and sort of drawn to a particular patient population, adolescents, drawn to certain cases, a lot of mental health cases, coping with chronic illness type of cases, specifically with the teens. And then I found out what adolescent medicine was. And it just seemed like the perfect interest for me, and it just fit with all my past experiences, but I did not know what it was until I probably stumbled upon it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Day one of med school, didn't know what CARMS was. I guess eventually discovered what CARMS was. Um, and I think it's a whole Canadian experience because I didn't know what CARMS was. And I had all these people talking about CARMS this and CARMS that. And I was just like, what on earth is carbs? Like, and having people look at me like, what do you mean you don't know what carbs is? And we'll put that in the description as to what carbs is. And I'm so glad you stumbled upon adolescent medicine because you and I would not have met had it not been for you stumbling upon it years ago. And you mentioned that you are in the tail end of your fellowship training. What have been some of the highs in terms of the training experience?
I think for me, the highs are and were. Oh, I'm not done yet. That makes me sentimental. I think the highs are the people, the people I've been able to work with, my co-fellows in training, and the staff I've been able to work with, the allied health team that have formed connections with me. I think adolescent medicine is quite an interesting field. You definitely have to have a certain perseverance and optimism and sense of humor to do well in this field. And I think that that's sort of the people that it attracts. And that's sort of the people I get along with. So it's been really nice. I've made some really great friends, met their families, like they've met my families. It's really nice to have those kind of deep, true connections. I think the other main thing for me that makes it very meaningful is those patient encounters where you feel like you're actually making a difference in a young person's life. And it looks different than maybe how I would set my expectations before, meaning like you can't fix everything for everyone. But when you have an encounter with a young person, you're able to sort of change their course even slightly or add something to their life or help support them through something difficult. It is really meaningful. I feel really blessed to have a job that is so meaningful to me.
And that's so beautifully said, Rasika, in terms of having a meaningful job and you are making such an impact one day at a time. You've mentioned some really key highs. And were there or have there been any lows that you're able to talk about during the course of your fellowship?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the lows sort of goes hand in hand with the nature of the work. So we're meeting kind of a vulnerable population at a time in their life where they're not doing so well. And it can be really emotionally draining. It can be quite a burden to carry. I know myself to be a very sensitive person. And so even for people who don't maybe describe themselves as sensitive, I still think the work can be heavy. And so sometimes taking that home, sometimes noticing that interfere in personal relationships, in relationships with my friends and family, or just in my own like mental, emotional well-being. I would say that's one of the tougher parts of the job. And then I think also just, completing training in a big organization, there is a lot of political hierarchy structures and practices in place that are common to, I would say, almost any organization. But sometimes navigating that as someone who maybe doesn't always fit in line with a standardized prototype can be challenging. And so I would say kind of those two things would be what highlight to me as the most challenging aspects of the fellowship.
You've mentioned some points that really hit home. In fact, when you've mentioned standardized prototype, like I actually got chills. Could you talk a little bit more about what your understanding is of that standardized prototype and how you navigate that?
Yeah, I think for me, as I'm just finishing my fellowship, I'm also sort of developing my own sense of what that means and what that looks like. But when I say it, I mean sort of that a lot of our like Western medical practices are quite like evidence-based, they're protocolized, standardized whenever they can be, not just for efficiency, but also for improved patient outcomes, for removing some of that objectivity and bias. So I definitely see merit and value to those processes. At the same time, I think a lot of physicians can resonate with this experience, like on the day to day when you're interacting with an individual patient and or family in front of you, that process may not apply. It might not work. And I think that it's our job, and I think we should rise to the occasion to be able to adapt to that. Now, I'm not saying like, oh, I know the best way to do so, because I don't. But I think just having the mindset of being able to sort of meet people where they're at truly and try to find approaches or try to find people who can help you find approaches when the rule book doesn't work anymore would be key. I can understand how that's really hard to operationalize in a large institution, but I think it's frustrating for a lot of providers that want to work in the gray.
And it's such an interesting thing that you mentioned the gray and also how not everyone has access to the rule book, so to speak. And I remember you and I having conversations about what are some of the things that you tried to do to help other people in terms of like doing their applications and also just trying to navigate the system better. Are you able to talk a bit about that work that you started doing and what got you started and what are some of the things that you've been able to do to help others navigate that medical education startup?
Sure. Yeah. I essentially am always happy to speak to young people that are interested in getting into the field of medicine and maybe don't really have connections or know where to start. I mean, sometimes it's as simple as offering them to either shadow you or get in touch with a friend of yours that's a child life therapist, that's a physiotherapist, a social worker, just someone in the field because they might not have access to that through their channels and networks. And then sometimes I would offer to help a young person with deciding what courses they should take or planning their university schedule or building out a resume, or they just want to chat about what sort of things are important to someone who might be reviewing an application. And these are things that a lot of people, I think, take for granted and maybe have heard from their big brother, sister, cousin, father, mother, aunt, whatever. But for people like me, there was nobody telling me this stuff. And I think it's helpful. It gives you a little bit more of a level playing field, or at least a step up to sort of help you get closer to that spot. And so I'm always happy to do that. I always like do caveat that with my experiences are just my own. And so it's just sort of what I've seen and what I think would be helpful and what I've sort of accumulated through my experiences and happy to pass along. But yeah, that's something I'm very passionate about as well.
It's so exciting to hear about your passion with young people and navigating the medical education system and seeing where you can help wherever you can, and coupling that with picking adolescent medicine, which is basically the same thing, but now in a clinic setting rather than in the sort of like
Mm.
medical education space. And so I feel like your practice and your skills just keep gravitating towards supporting young people, which I think is so amazing, Rasika.
That's interesting. That's an interesting connection. Yeah.
I absolutely love it, even as I listen to it. I know you're now in the process of, coming towards the end of your fellowship. How was it for your family when you had decided, not just finishing med school, but getting into the fellowship program? How was that for your parents? How was that for your sibling?
Yeah. So I think for me, I've been really fortunate. I grew up and grow up with a family that really does value education, but more so like whatever I wish to pursue. And they didn't really make me feel any type of way about pursuing more education. If I told them I'm going to do 2 more years of something, they'd be like, go ahead, do it. I mean, it's a long time. I don't think I have any more left in me. It's always been an environment that my brother and I grew up in around curiosity, pursuing your passions, and just like my parents would support us as best as they could. And then we kind of support each other as well. So yeah, and I haven't had to move too far either. So I've always had sort of my family close by. I do lean on them a lot.
That's so great to hear. And family aside, I'm wondering if you've had mentors who've helped you on this journey so far and how important mentorship is for you.
I do see a tremendous value in mentorship. And I would say, from my experience thus far, it has been more informal mentors that have fallen into place. And I remember when I was in a previous life in business, I felt this pressure to network. They always talked about networking. And I was like, what is that? How am I going to network? I'm like 20 years old. I have no networks. But I think what it is to me now is it's the people you genuinely meet and connect with and form those lasting impressions with for whatever reason, whether it's for life, whether it's for a certain part of your life. And so right now I have some mentors in the fellowship program. I have mentors from my pediatric residency training. And then I have mentors that have just known me outside of medicine throughout my life. They're all equally valuable and important. Obviously, I look to my parents as mentors and my big brother, but everybody has a different experience and perspective, and everybody has a different understanding of you. And so truly, I will speak to the tremendous value of mentorship, but I don't know if I've ever really tapped into those formal mentors where somebody assigns you to someone. And that sort of has been like a driving force for me. I think it's more so been informal mentors.
Do they usually know that they're mentors? Like when you're gaining this experience or gaining this point of wisdom or information, do they typically know, or it's someone that you sort of like set in your mind that, hey, this is somebody that would be my informal mentor?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if I've ever sort of formally stated it, but I will, thank someone if I've chatted with them and I've actually sort of picked their brain or asked for their advice. I'd be pretty explicit when I do set up kind of meetings and be like, I really would like your advice on this, or I would really appreciate your thoughts on this, and then thanking them afterwards. I think it sort of does highlight the note that I'm seeking sort of their advice, their mentorship, their guidance, and I appreciate that from them, but I don't know if I've ever sort of formally established anything.
I'd like to shift a little bit. There's something you mentioned, something about business when you were 20. Could you tell us about your other education pursuits? Was that before med school or during med school or in between?
Yeah, that was in another life, Jerry. That was before med school. So when I did my undergraduate degree, I minored in economics and did my major in health sciences. And I did my final year's thesis in health economics. So there was like kind of this interesting niche space of both interests combined. And that's what prompted me to do my master's in business administration. So I did that at the University of Toronto following my undergraduate degree. And in that program, I did take a lot of healthcare management type courses, pharmaceutical strategy, health economics, things like that, with the goal of working sort of in the more macro level healthcare industry. And I ended up working in healthcare consulting for both a public and then private company, healthcare consulting and strategy. And in those roles, I really did like the work I was doing. I found it really interesting. It was really challenging, but it just wasn't the right fit. I was working in a hospital at one point, and my favorite part of the day was actually just being in the elevator and listening to patients talk and like chatting with them before we went up to the offices and sort of pumped out reports. It was still a meaningful work sort of down the road, but I wanted to be more engaged with the end users of the healthcare system, like be interacting with patients, hear their stories, and sort of be able to support in that way. So I ended up going to medical school after that to switch gears.
That is so impressive. I know you talk about it. The first time I heard you mentioning you've done an MBA, I was like, what? Could this girl be any more impressive and amazing? What else are you going to pull out, and shock me with? And I think it's such an important skill or set of skills that you learned during your MBA training, it sounds like. Now that you've experienced both medical school and sort of like business school, and I know this is a little bit of a trick question, but do you think it's valuable to have more doctors investing in business school, economics, health economics, that sort of thing as part of their core training?
I often don't tell people I have an MBA because then they expect me to be good at finance and accounting, and I'm not. But overall, yes, I do think I learned a lot of valuable skills. And I think it's going to help me, not only like me as a person, but I think it will help me in any organizational leadership role I take on for that institution. Just my opinion. I think it could be very beneficial for physicians if it was a part of their training. Not, like I said, not just for themselves. Often physicians end up incorporating or running their own business or practice, and that's something that they certainly would take value from, but also just being kind of thinking about the leadership structure in hospitals and how decisions are made. It's interesting. It's interesting. There does sometimes seem to be a bit of divide between the individuals that have sort of the clinical medical knowledge and practical expertise about patient interactions and flow. And then you have sort of your administrative staff that have a different level of expertise and understanding. And then you have your management or leadership that has a very different model of understanding. And so oftentimes all of them are at the table, and it does seem a bit incongruent to sort of mesh that together. I wonder if there is a way to equip physicians with a bit more of that sense so that they can have more of a influential role in that space. But yeah, that's just my
Yeah.
thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely. And, I'm just putting it out there. It sounds like you are the kind of leader I would want to work under because you understand the medical parts and you also understand the economics parts and the management aspects as well, which is such a perfect, like, combination of things. I personally, and again, this is my opinion, I'd want in a leader, in a healthcare space, especially because in a different conversation with another clinician, we are talking about not a lot of medics are taught about financial health, taught about how do
Mhm.
you handle your own personal finances. But then on top of that, how do you manage, a healthcare system? How do you, look at numbers critically and, sort of say, hey, this is not making sense? Or how do we make this flow more efficient and not just be seen as the person who delivers just a medical, or clinical service? I'm glad that you went through it. I know it wasn't giving you as much fulfillment as you are getting now as a clinician and also, soon to be staff in Adolescent Medicine. But I'm so glad that you were able to go through that and give us that experience. It's really eye-opening. So thank you, Rasika.
Yeah, no, of course. And it was a good experience. I was very, very glad to have done it at that age, at that stage. Like it certainly helped me then and helps me now. It definitely got me to where I needed to be.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, you've told us about the value family has had and also just, trying to navigate through a medical education system while helping other people. And at the same time, you're coming to the end of your fellowship, you're preparing for exams and transition to practice, how do you take care of your mental health?
Oh, yes. I think that I do lean on my family and friends a lot. I notice in myself when I'm starting to feel burnt out, I get more irritable, and that's sort of my cue to take a step back. I think, in any training right now, my schedule is not under my control. So there are things that I do, like little tricks to kind of keep myself balanced. I take all my vacation days and I'm someone who spreads them out throughout the year. So I have frequent breaks when I need them. And I have become quite good at setting better boundaries for work. And I would say I know that's not always possible. It certainly was not possible last year when I had my Royal College exam to study for. But this year, I have a bit more capacity to do that. I spend time with my friends outside of medicine often. I like to spend time in nature. I like to read. I've gotten back into things that I really like reading and journaling. And I speak to people outside of medicine for support when I need it as well, especially when we do have really tricky clinical encounters. And sometimes it does involve debriefing with people in medicine, like in adolescent medicine, and specifically about really challenging patient encounters that I need support with. So I guess long way of saying I self-reflect, know myself, know when I'm sort of reaching that point and need that support. But even outside of that, I'm someone who constantly likes to reach out, ask for help, ask for support, but also just ask for someone to hang out with and have a chance to have some balance between work and my life.
Yeah, all those sound so amazing and so practical too. I really value you sharing that with us because I think for a lot of students, one of the challenges is how do I balance this out? There's no time for time. So, how do I do all these things? And I absolutely love the various things that you've mentioned. I'm just wondering, there's been a shift in terms of how the competency framework that we lean on in terms of what are the various competencies we're supposed to learn as clinicians. And one of the things that some of the clinicians, especially clinicians of color, are pushing towards is really taking on equity, diversity, and inclusion as a huge part of the competencies within the framework. I don't know if you've heard, like they're trying to do a lot more of this and to educate more people around this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, in terms of the various competencies, when you reflect on your journey so far as a learner and also as someone who's become a mentor and a guide for other medical learners, have these competencies been able to support you sufficiently in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion so far in your journey?
So you mean sort of the competency by design, like the current curriculum?
Yeah.
I would say so. Definitely is an area of interest of mine. And I may not know too much about sort of how they're planning to adjust and adapt the current frameworks. But part of my research interest is working on understanding how we as physicians and clinicians are screening for like EDI related issues in our patients. And that does sort of lean on what kind of training, experience, familiarity we get or exposed to or come with into our respective fields. And so I could imagine that it would highlight a bit of a gap in sort of comfort, familiarity, expertise in understanding these issues for our patients. But sort of speaking to our own experiences as clinicians, I mean, I think it's a really good question, but it's a really hard question, Sherry.
I know it's a hard one. I know it's a hard one, and we've sort of had versions of this conversation in different ways. I think for me personally, I'd most heavily heard about equity, diversity, and inclusion when I started my program in Toronto. And before that, I knew there was a version of that out there. But given that I had been coming from Kenya, where the people of color are the majority, the Black people are a majority, and coming into a space where suddenly, for the first time in my life, I was a minority. And I was just like, whoa, like this is different for me as a person and also different for me as a clinician. And I think I'm asking this question because through our conversations, you helped me think more critically and more holistically about what equity, diversity, and inclusion look like in terms of being able to support my goals during the time I was in the program. I'm not sure if you knew that, but just those conversations did help. I love hearing about the fact that the research that you're doing is trying to interrogate some of that and see where the gaps are in terms of clinical care. And I'm just wondering, amongst healthcare professionals during their medical education journeys, what your observations have been.
Yeah, I agree. And I know we had those conversations as well. So, like, I completely understand where you're coming from. And I think sometimes I will say, I do know that I have an advantage having been born and raised and trained in a Canadian system. So, yes, I am a person of color. I identify as a woman of color. I still know that I have a lot of privilege and advantage in navigating these systems because of my training, my upbringing, just having completed education here. So, that being said, I think there's a lot of work to be done in this space. Like, certainly, especially recently, there has been a large push towards shining light on this area. I guess for me, like, I don't really have the answer necessarily. I'm always happy to come to the table and brainstorm. But I think for me, what is going to be the most important thing is sort of seeing these conversations turn into action, right? Like turn into actual change on a systems level, which I think is what everybody is going for. But I think it's challenging, right? We have conversations and committees and subcommittees, and it's great to see that work and be a part of that work. But, if I'm being honest, have we seen that implemented into change? Probably not yet, right? Probably maybe in some level.
Yeah.
But I would say, I think it's a larger scale thing. I think it's going to take time. So certainly, I think that there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I totally hear you on that in terms of there's been a lot of planning around it, and now it's the execution stage, I think, in terms of just getting things done. I'm just wondering, as we shift from that, given all your experiences in medical school, in business school, and now with fellowship, what would your words of advice be for someone who's thinking about a fellowship? What would your nuggets be for this person who's trying to think through their choices and trying to make some decisions about fellowship?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, it was totally worth it. I feel like I have found exactly where I want to be, and I've met really great people along the way. So I have a lot of positive things to say, but I know it's not for everyone. So my advice would be for anyone who's sort of considering doing that extra training or specializing further is to sort of think about what their values are, what their goals are, what they would like to see in their career. And they may not know exactly that just yet, but I would encourage them to continue self-reflecting, talking to people, and sort of like spending a day in the life of to really get a sense of is this kind of what they want. If this is like the patient population that someone wants to work with, and this is the type of work they want to be doing, I absolutely think it was worth it. And I think that it does give you a tremendous skill set in a niche area that's really not only practically helpful, but it really does help you connect with your patients on an even more enhanced level. But if somebody is more interested in being a generalist, seeing a little bit of everything, is not really interested in sort of acquiring that extra subset of training or skills or whatever the case is, then it might not be the best fit. It certainly is a time commitment, a financial commitment, might involve relocating and things like that. So I think it's quite independent. But for me, I would say it was very much worth it, and certainly reinforced my decision to switch out of my previous role, switch industries, transition careers. I feel like I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to do, which is nice. I have all positive things to say, but I know it's not right for everyone.
That's so fantastic, Rasika. It's not everyone's cup of tea. And especially with the rigor with which Canadian fellowships are. I'm yet to find a Canadian fellowship that's easy peasy. Like all of them are really intense in different ways. So I really like that. If it's for you, great. But if it's not less to be a generalist in terms of, like, in Kenya, we call them general practitioners, where you've not specialized in a particular area. And that's still a very valid pathway versus the person who's decided to specialize. And I think there's always been that challenge of, oh, why haven't you specialized yet? And, you should be specializing. And I was just like, but why? Who said that everyone has to specialize and subspecialize? So I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate the conversation that we've been able to have today, Rasika, and for you being able to share what your medical education journey has been like. And as always, just getting to learn more and glean more from you. So I really appreciate this, Rasika.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it too. And your friendship means a lot to me and always did throughout fellowship. And I've had the chance to meet such amazing international trainees that I wouldn't have gotten in another program or had I not pursued this subspecialty. And that is not something I take lightly. I truly love and value that experience. And, we're all going to reunite at weddings and at future celebrations or through travel. And that means the world to me.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that, Rasika. I definitely look forward to the reunions for sure. We've been doing a lot of planning. So for sure with the reunions. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what people have to say about our episode. I will get some way for people to be able to connect with you directly should they have any questions, like an email or a social media handle, which we can put as part of our notes, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, okay. Of course.
Okay. So thank you so much for coming on this safari with me and just getting to discover Rasika's process and who Dr. Rasika Singh, Adolescent Medicine specialist, is transitioning into. And I really appreciate the time that you've taken today, Rasika.
No, of course. Thank you so much for having me. I've thoroughly enjoyed the safari.
All right. Okay, everyone. Until next time. Bye. I'm so glad you stayed tuned. Please get the word out and share it with at least 3 people. Make this episode like a chain letter. Share it, share it, share it. Come back for the next leg of our safari where we'll be talking about
this is something you'll be doing for the rest of your life. Don't commit to do something because you want to make money. A lot of opportunities, like, of course, money is an important thing. The main thing for me would be, but also think of, is it something you enjoy to do? Is it something even when you feel tired or you're stressed? Is it something that when you wake up, you feel, okay, let me go to work and do 1, 2, 3.
Listeners are advised to use their own judgment and discretion when applying any information discussed in this and all podcast episodes to their specific situation. Always seek the advice of a qualified professional if you have any concerns or questions regarding a particular subject matter. You can find this and other episodes of this podcast on our website at www.fellowshipsafaris.org. You can also find all our episodes on all podcast platforms. Reach out to us on social media as Fellowship Safaris on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, and our Twitter handle is @fellowshipsafar. You could also send us an email on fellowshipsafaris@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you and interacting with what you have to say about the Fellowship Safaris podcast. It takes a village to make this podcast. The executive producer and original music is done by Mokavi Maweu. The sound engineer is Tevin Sudi with thanks to AQ Studios. Graphic design was done by Benjamin Mboya. We would like to give a special shout out to Josephine Karianjahe and Melissa Mbogwa of Africa Podfest. All rights reserved by Dr. Jerry Karianjahe and the Fellowship Safaris podcast.